"Dad, you're too old," he said, his smile as cold as steel. "It's time for you to rest." He didn't want me to rest. He wanted me removed. He called me senile to steal my company, so I pretended to be exactly that just to watch him destroy himself. Before we continue, subscribe. The story of how an old architect used his own blueprints to design his son's downfall is a lesson in poetic justice you will not want to miss. My office at Vance & Sons was on the 10th floor, but my perspective was always from the ground up. I was a builder, a man who understood that the strength of any structure, be it a skyscraper or a company, lies in its foundation. For 40 years, my wife Eleanor and I had poured our lives into that foundation. We built Vance & Sons not on risky gambles and flashy deals, but on a simple, unbreakable creed. Build things that last. We built with integrity, with patience, and with an unwavering respect for the numbers. Not just the numbers on a balance sheet, but the numbers that govern the physical world, the load-bearing capacity of steel, the tensile strength of concrete. Eleanor was the soul of the company, the artist to my engineer. She saw the beauty in a perfectly designed arch, the poetry in a well-laid foundation. The little model of the bridge on my desk, that was her last project with me before she passed. A perfect union of strength and grace, just like her. When she was gone, the soul of the company felt quieter. I continued to run things with the same steady hand, but the joy was muted. Ethan, my only son, had been rising through the ranks. He was smart, ambitious, with a restless energy that I had once mistaken for passion. After Eleanor's death, I made him CEO, believing it was time for a new generation, a new energy. I would stay on as chairman, a guiding hand, a guardian of the foundation. It was a father's dream, and it was my greatest miscalculation. Ethan saw my caution not as wisdom, but as weakness. He saw my patience as stagnation. He was a man of the new age, a believer in disruption, in high-risk, high-reward ventures. He saw the solid, profitable company I had built not as a legacy to be preserved, but as a launch pad to be burned for fuel. The conflict that would shatter our family began, as so many do, with a single ambitious project. It was called Cityscape, a massive luxury high-rise development on the city's waterfront. On paper, it was a visionary project, but I, the old builder, looked at the blueprints and saw something else. I saw the numbers. The financial projections were based on a wildly optimistic market. The construction timeline was impossibly aggressive, and the amount of debt the company would have to take on to fund it, it was staggering. It was a gamble that could, with one downturn in the market, sink the entire company. I called a family, meeting at my home. It was not a corporate boardroom, but our dining room table, a place of 1,000 happy memories. I tried to speak to him not as a chairman, but as a father. "Ethan," I said, laying out my own, more conservative analysis. "This is too much, too fast. It's a beautiful vision, but the foundation is weak. The risk is too great. This isn't just a project. It's the entire legacy of this family on the line." He didn't even look at my analysis. He just smiled, a tight, condescending smile that I was beginning to know too well. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a false, placating patience, "I appreciate your concern, I really do, but the market has changed. The old ways of doing things, the slow and steady approach, it doesn't work anymore. You have to be bold." "This isn't bold, Ethan," I replied, my voice firm. "It's reckless." "It's the future," he countered, his patience wearing thin. And then came the words that drew the first crack in our own foundation. "Dad, you're too old. You don't understand the market anymore. With all due respect, you're out of touch. Maybe it's time for you to just relax, enjoy your retirement, and let me handle things." He was not asking for my trust. He was demanding my obsolescence. He was dismissing my 40 years of experience as irrelevant. The conversation ended there, in a cold, tense stalemate. I knew he would not back down, but I never could have predicted his next move. A week later, at the quarterly board meeting, he played his hand. After the standard reports, he stood up, his face a mask of solemn, feigned concern. "Members of the board," he began, "it is with a heavy heart that I must address a delicate issue. My father, our esteemed chairman, Arthur Vance, has not been himself lately." A murmur went through the room. His decisions have become erratic. His judgment, once unerring, has become clouded. He has expressed paranoid objections to the Cityscape project, a project that is vital to our company's future. I am worried about him, not just as a CEO, but as a son. He let the words hang in the air, a poisonous insinuation. Then he delivered the kill shot. Therefore, for the protection of this company and for my father's own well-being, I am proposing an independent evaluation of his mental fitness to continue serving as chairman. The room was silent. I looked around at the board. Members. Some looked shocked. But others, the younger ones he had brought in, the ones who shared his move fast and break things philosophy, were nodding in grim agreement. And then Ethan introduced his independent expert, Dr. Miles Corbin, a psychiatrist with a slick smile and eyes that held no warmth. I recognized him. Corbin was a man whose own son Ethan had helped get out of a serious legal scrape a few years back. He wasn't an expert. He was a paid accomplice. I saw the whole thing in that instant, with the clarity of a finished blueprint. This wasn't a concern. It was a coup. A carefully planned, ruthless move to have me declared mentally incompetent, to seize absolute control, and to ram his reckless project through without my interference. They were not just questioning my judgment. They were trying to erase my mind, to turn me into a legal non-entity. My first instinct was to fight, to roar, to expose the lie right, there and then. But I looked at Ethan's confident, cold face, and I saw the faces of the board members he had already won over. A public fight would be messy, ugly, and I realized with a chilling certainty I would likely lose. They would paint me as exactly what they claimed I was, an angry, confused old man lashing out in a paranoid rage. So in that moment I made a different calculation. The old builder, the man of foundations, decided on a new strategy. If my son wanted to cast me in the role of a senile old man, then I would give him the performance of a lifetime. I would not fight his narrative. I would inhabit it. I would become the weak, forgetful, harmless old fool he wanted me to be. And from within that perfect camouflage, I would gather my tools, find his structural weaknesses, and I would bring his entire treacherous world crashing down. I leaned back in my chair, letting my shoulders slump. I brought a trembling hand to my forehead. Perhaps my son is right, I said, my voice a frail, confused whisper that echoed in the silent boardroom. I have been so forgetful lately. The demolition had begun, and I was the one holding the detonator. My performance of weakness was met, with a wave of relief and pity in the boardroom. Ethan rushed to my side, playing the part of the devoted son. "It's okay, Dad. We'll get you the best care. This is for the best." He was so blinded by his own cleverness, he couldn't see the glint of steel beneath my feigned confusion. He thought he was managing a decline. He had no idea he was witnessing the beginning of a meticulously planned siege. The days that followed were a masterclass in deception. I embraced my new role with the dedication of a method actor. I became the man they wanted me to be. At board meetings, which I was still permitted to attend as a figurehead, I would ask the same question twice. I would misplace important folders, only to find them in an obvious place a few minutes later with a flustered apology. I would call board members by the wrong names, then correct myself with a sad, self-deprecating chuckle. The old memory isn't what it used to be, I'd say, and they would nod in sad, condescending agreement. Ethan was in his glory. He was now the undisputed king, the decisive leader, hampered only by the sentimental need to manage his fading father. He treated me with a cloying public kindness that was a constant performance for the board. "Let's not overwhelm Dad with too many details," he'd say, waving away a complex financial report. "The important thing is we're moving forward." And move forward he did. The cityscape project was fast-tracked, the loans were secured, the contracts were drafted. He was building his monument of risk, and I, his senile father, was his greatest asset, a living, breathing rubber stamp for his ambition. But while Arthur the fossil was fumbling with papers in the boardroom, Arthur the founder was quietly activating his own network. My most crucial ally was Clara, my executive assistant for over 30 years. She was a woman of quiet loyalty and fierce intelligence, a woman who had been with me since the first foundation was poured. Ethan had kept her on, seeing her as a harmless relic, a part of the old furniture. He had no idea she was the most advanced surveillance system in the building. I met her for coffee, far from the office. "Clara," I said, dropping the mask of senility the moment we were alone. "Ethan thinks I am a history book he has already finished reading. He is wrong. I need you to be my eyes and ears. I need every document, every email, every meeting related to Cityscape. I need to know who he's talking to, what promises he's making. He believes you are just a secretary. Let him believe that." Clara's face, which had been etched with worry, hardened with a resolve that matched my own. "He is not the man you raised, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, angry whisper. "He is destroying everything you and Eleanor built. Of course, I will help you." She became my silent partner, my spy, in the heart of the enemy's camp. Every evening, a discreet encrypted email would arrive from her, a detailed report of the day's machinations. My second front was the medical evaluation. I submitted to Dr. Corbin's sessions with a performance of weary cooperation. The sessions were a farce, a carefully scripted play designed to lead to a predetermined conclusion. Corbin would ask leading questions about my memory, my mood, my paranoia about the company's direction. "Do you often feel that others are working against you, Arthur?" he'd ask, his voice a soothing, manipulative purr. "Sometimes," I'd reply, looking confused. "It feels like the company, it's moving too fast. Is it just me, Doctor? Do I just not understand anymore?" But I was not just a passive actor in his play. I was conducting my own evaluation. I knew Ethan's greatest weakness, the flaw in his character that I, as his father, had seen for years, his desperate, insatiable need for approval and recognition. He didn't just want to be successful. He wanted to be seen as a visionary, a genius who had surpassed his legendary father. And I decided to use that weakness as my primary weapon. During one of our sessions, which I was secretly recording with a micro recorder hidden in my pen, I began to set my trap. "You know, Doctor," I said, my voice filled with a father's feigned anxiety. "I worry about Ethan. He's so brilliant, so ambitious, but this cityscape project, it's massive. I look at the plans and the engineering, the financing. It's all on the very edge of what's possible. It's the kind of project that makes a man a legend or breaks him completely." Corbin, sensing an opportunity to gather more evidence of my anxieties, leaned in. "Tell me more about your concerns." "He's a genius, my boy," I continued, letting a tear well up in my eye. "But he's impatient. He sees the glorious skyscraper, but I see the foundation, and I fear it's too much for him to handle alone. He needs a big win, a fast one, to prove to everyone, to prove to me that he's capable. But a project of this scale, one mistake, one small miscalculation, and the whole thing could come down. I knew Corbin would report this conversation back, to Ethan, word for word. And I knew how my son would react. He would hear my fears not as a warning, but as a challenge. He would see my doubts as the final motivation he needed to push the project forward, faster, more recklessly, cutting any corners necessary to get the contract signed and the construction started, just to prove his senile old father wrong. I was not just playing a role, I was directing the play. And I was writing a final tragic act for my son, a tragedy of his own making. My psychological gambit worked perfectly. Just as I predicted, Ethan interpreted my worries as a direct challenge to his authority and competence. Clara's daily reports were filled with his increasingly frantic energy. He was pushing the cityscape project forward with a reckless, almost manic desperation. He bypassed standard safety reviews. He pressured the finance department to approve questionable loan agreements. He was a man running a race against the ghost of his father's expectations, and he was cutting every corner to win. He was so focused on the finish line that he failed to see the cliff's edge just beyond it. While Ethan was busy building his monument to his own ego, I was meticulously analyzing the blueprints of his impending disaster. Every night, in the quiet of my study, I would review the documents Clara had sent me, the loan agreements, the construction contracts, the engineering reports. As the senile chairman, I still had access to everything, but no one believed I had the capacity to understand it. They saw an old man staring blankly at pages of numbers. They didn't see the builder who was reading the story those numbers told. And the story was a horror story. The debt-to-equity ratio was unsustainable. The projected profit margins were based on a fantasy. The structural engineering relied on unproven cost-cutting techniques. The entire project wasn't just a building on a weak foundation, it was a house of cards, waiting for a single, gentle puff of wind, and I was preparing to unleash a hurricane. My secret weapon was not just the information Clara was providing, but my own, deep, institutional knowledge. I knew every contract, every relationship, every secret handshake that held the city's construction industry together. Ethan thought he was a master of this world, but he was just a tourist. I had drawn the maps. I began my own quiet, parallel set of communications. I had lunch with the head of the construction union, an old friend who was deeply concerned about the non-union labor and safety shortcuts Ethan was proposing. I had a chance encounter with the city's chief building inspector, another old colleague, and casually mentioned my concerns as a confused old father about the project's aggressive timeline. I planted seeds of doubt, not as a powerful chairman, but as a harmless, worried old man. It was the most effective kind of intelligence, the kind that the enemy never sees as a threat. The final piece of my plan came from Dr. Corbin's report. As expected, it was a masterpiece of pseudoscientific slander. It concluded that I, Arthur Vance, was suffering from age-related cognitive decline with paranoid tendencies, and was no longer fit to hold a position of fiduciary responsibility. It recommended my immediate removal as chairman for my own protection. The board scheduled a final meeting to vote on my removal and to give final rubber stamp approval for the cityscape project. This was the moment Ethan had been working towards. The day he would finally, officially, step out of my shadow and become the sole, undisputed master of Vance & Sons. He planned a large, catered event for the signing. He invited investors, city officials, even the press. He wanted a public coronation. And I was determined to give him a public execution. The night before the meeting, I met with Clara one last time. She was pale, her hands trembling. "Arthur, he's going to destroy the company," she whispered. "He's not listening to anyone. It's like he's possessed." "He is possessed, Clara," I said gently, "by his own ambition. But tomorrow, the exorcism begins." I gave her a simple set of instructions, a single crucial task to perform at the height of the ceremony. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She finally understood. I was not a victim. I was the architect of a counterattack so audacious, so complete, that no one would see it coming until it was too late. I went home and sat in my office, the model of Eleanor's bridge in front of me. I had spent weeks playing a role, pretending to be a man whose mind was failing, but in reality, my mind had never been clearer. I saw the entire structure of Ethan's ambition, every weak joint, every stress point, every fatal flaw. The design was complete. The materials were in place. All that was left was the final public and catastrophic act of deconstruction, and I, the builder, was ready to bring the house down. The signing ceremony was everything Ethan had dreamed of. It was a spectacle of corporate power and self-congratulation. He stood at the podium, a conquering hero, speaking of vision, of boldness, of a new era for Vance and Sons. He spoke of his legacy, a word he used without a hint of irony. And as he spoke, he would occasionally glance towards me with a look of pitying affection. I was the ghost at his feast, the symbol of the past he had so cleverly overcome. I played my part to perfection. I looked confused, my eyes wandering the room, occasionally nodding off, the very picture of a man whose time had passed. And while we looked to the future, Ethan said, his voice dripping with false sentiment, we must also honor the past. I want to thank my father, Arthur Vance, for the foundation he built. And while his health no longer allows him to lead, his spirit will always be a part of this company. A smattering of polite, sympathetic applause was directed at me. I offered a weak, confused smile. The performance was nearly complete. He then introduced the board members, who voted unanimously to approve the cityscape project. Then came the second vote. And now, the lead board member said, we vote on the motion to accept Dr. Corbin's medical recommendation and formally relieve Mr. Arthur Vance of his duties as chairman for his own well-being. Again, a unanimous vote. It was official. I was out, cast aside. Ethan's victory was absolute. He then invited the lead investors and city officials to the grand signing table. The multi-billion-dollar contracts were laid out. The expensive, pens uncapped. This was the moment of his coronation. He was no longer just the CEO. He was the undisputed king. As he prepared to sign the first document, a document that would indebt the company for a generation, he looked at me one last time, a final, triumphant smirk on his face. This was his checkmate, and that was my cue, as his pen touched the paper. The large screens behind him, which had been displaying a glorious artist's rendering of the cityscape tower, suddenly flickered and changed. The first image that appeared was a scanned copy of a front-page newspaper, article from 10 years ago. The headline was stark. Ethical inquiry launched into Dr. Miles Corbin's expert testimony in landmark case. A confused murmur went through the room. Ethan froze, his pen hovering over the contract. Dr. Corbin, who was sitting in the front row, went rigid. Then the screen changed again. This time it was a legal document, a settlement, showing that the lawsuit against Dr. Corbin for professional misconduct had been quietly dropped after an anonymous party paid a substantial sum to the plaintiffs. The murmur in the room grew louder. Ethan looked frantically towards the tech booth. But the technician just shrugged, pointing to his screen, which was now displaying the words, "External feed override." Then came the audio. My voice, frail and confused, filled the room, the secret recording from my session with Corbin. I fear it's too much for him to handle alone, my recorded voice said, filled with a father's fake anxiety. Then came Corbin's voice, soothing, manipulative. Tell me more about your concerns, Arthur. Does he seem reckless to you? The room was silent now, every eye glued to the screen. Ethan was white as a sheet. And then came the final, devastating piece of evidence. A new document appeared on the screen. It was a bank transfer statement. It showed a payment of $250,000 made 2 days after the lawsuit against Corbin was dropped. The payment was from a holding company, and then the screen changed one last time, showing the public registration of that holding company. The sole director was listed as Ethan Vance. The silence was shattered. A reporter in the back shouted, "Is this a payoff? Did you bribe your own father's doctor?" Ethan was speechless. He looked at Corbin, who looked like he was about to faint. The investors were starting to stand up, their faces masks of cold fury. The foundation of his coronation had just turned to quicksand. The revelation of the payoff was just the first charge I had planted. It was designed to shatter his credibility. Now it was time to demolish the project itself. Before Ethan could formulate a coherent lie, the feed on the screens changed again. The panicked face of the technician in the booth showed he had no control. This was my show, run remotely by a cybersecurity expert I had hired, a man who owed me a favor. The next image that appeared was a blueprint, not the glossy, simplified version Ethan had shown the investors, but a highly detailed, complex structural schematic of the Cityscape Tower's foundation. It was covered in my own handwritten red notes. What is this? One of the lead investors, a man named Henderson, demanded, his voice booming across the shocked room. "That," I said, my voice calm and clear, though I had not yet stood up, "is the truth." All eyes turned to me. The frail, senile old man was gone. In his place sat the chairman, the founder, the man whose name was on the building. I slowly rose to my feet, leaning not on my cane but on the heavy mahogany table. My son has spoken of vision, of the future. But he seems to have forgotten the first principle of building, a principle I taught him myself. A structure is only as strong as its foundation, and the foundation of the Cityscape project is catastrophically, and I believe criminally, flawed. The screens began to cycle through a series of documents, each one a nail in the coffin of the project. First, my detailed financial analysis. "This," I said as a spreadsheet filled the screen, "is the real financial model for this project, not the fantasy my son presented to you. It shows that, based on realistic market projections and accurate construction costs, this project is not profitable. In fact, it is projected to run at a loss of nearly $500 million, a loss that would bankrupt Vance and Sons and leave you, the investors, with nothing but a very tall, very empty, and very expensive hole in the ground." Henderson, the lead investor, was staring at the screen, his face pale. He was a smart man. He could read the numbers, and the numbers were telling him he was on the verge of the worst deal of his life. "Furthermore," I continued, as the screen shifted to a geological survey map of the waterfront property. "The site itself is unstable. My son, in his haste, relied on a 10-year-old survey. I commissioned a new one last month. It shows significant soil liquefaction risk. To build a tower of this size on that land, without the deep pier foundation system that my son deemed too expensive, would not just be reckless. It would be an act of criminal negligence." A city official in the front row looked like he was about to be sick. He was the one who had approved the zoning permits based on the old, outdated survey. "And finally," I said, as the screen showed, a side-by-side comparison of two steel beam specifications. "The materials. The project calls for a new experimental alloy from a supplier my son has a significant, undisclosed personal investment in. My own analysis shows this alloy has not been sufficiently tested for long-term stress corrosion in a saline environment. It is cheaper, yes, but it is also a catastrophic failure waiting to happen." I looked around the room, at the horrified faces of the investors, the panicked city officials, the scribbling reporters. I had not raised my voice. I had not shouted. I had simply presented the facts. The undeniable, structural truth. "My son accused me of being a relic, of being out of touch," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "He is right. I am out of touch with a business philosophy that prioritizes reckless gambles over sound engineering. I am out of touch with a world that values a flashy presentation over a solid foundation. And I am most certainly out of touch with the idea that you can build a legacy by betraying the very man who taught you how to build. I then looked directly at the press cameras in the back. As the founder, and still the largest single shareholder of this company, I cannot and will not allow this project to move forward. As of this moment, I am calling for an emergency vote of no confidence in our CEO, Ethan Vance. The room erupted. It was a complete and utter rout. The investors were shouting at Ethan, the city officials were rushing for the exits, and the reporters were having a field day. Ethan just stood there at the podium under the banner that read, "The future is now." But his future had just been demolished before his eyes. He was no longer a visionary CEO. He was just a boy, standing in the ruins of a house of cards, brought down by the quiet, methodical, and inescapable truth of his father's expertise. After the storm, there is always a quiet. A heavy, ringing silence where you can finally see the full extent of the damage. The investors had fled, the press had their headline, the board members had scattered like rats from a sinking ship. The cityscape project was dead, and with it, my son's career. All that was left in that grand, empty room was the ruin of a man and his father. I walked towards him, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He didn't look up as I approached. He just stared at the now blank screens, the screens that had, moments before, been the instruments of his public execution. It was all a lie, wasn't it? He said, his voice a hollow whisper, not asking me but asking the universe. The forgetfulness, the confusion, all of it. No, Ethan, I replied, standing beside him now, not as a victor, but as a witness. The confusion was real. It was yours. You were confused about the difference between risk and recklessness. You were confused about the difference between a legacy and a balance sheet. And most of all, you were confused about the difference between a father and a roadblock. He finally turned to look at me, and I saw the full, undiluted truth in his eyes. There was no anger left. There was no arrogance. There was only the vast, empty chasm of a man who has lost everything and knows with a terrible certainty that he has no one to blame but himself. You planned this?" he choked out. "Every step." "An architect always has a plan, Ethan," I said, my voice gentle. "You designed a coup. I designed a controlled demolition. The difference is, my design was based on a solid foundation of truth. Yours was built on a lie. A structure built on lies will always, always collapse." "You destroyed me," he whispered. "No," I said, and this was the most important truth of all. "I did not destroy you. I destroyed the man you were becoming. The arrogant, greedy, ruthless man who would sell out his own father for a shortcut to glory. I destroyed the man who was a stranger to me. I did it, in the desperate last hope of finding my son again underneath all the rubble." He started to cry then. Not the loud, theatrical sobs of a man seeking pity, but the silent, shoulder-shaking tears of a man who is truly broken. The tears of a man who has finally been forced to look at his own reflection and is horrified by what he sees. I reached out, and for a moment, I was going to place a comforting hand on his shoulder, but I stopped. Comfort was not what he needed. Justice was not yet complete. The lesson was not yet over. "You have lost the company," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You have lost your reputation. You have lost the respect of every person in this city. You are no longer a CEO. You are no longer a visionary. You are just a man with a choice." He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, a question in his eyes. "The board will formally oust you tomorrow," I stated, not as a threat, but as a fact. "They will offer the chairmanship back to me. I will accept, and my first act as chairman will be to address the fate of the cityscape project. But it's a disaster, he stammered. The land is unstable, the finances are a lie. Yes, I agreed. As a luxury high-rise, it is a disaster. But as something else, it has potential. I walked over to the signing table and unrolled one of my own blueprints, the ones I had been working on in secret. The design on the page was not a gleaming tower for the rich. It was a series of low-rise, beautifully designed, and structurally sound buildings. This, I said, is the new cityscape project, the Eleanor Vance Community, a mixed-income housing development with a public library and a vocational training center for young builders. It will not make us billions, but it will build something that lasts. It will build a community. It is the kind of project your mother would have been proud of. He stared at the blueprint, at the elegant, honest lines of a structure designed to serve, not to impress. And it needs a project manager, I said, delivering my final, devastating, and perhaps merciful judgment. Someone who knows the site, someone who knows the contractors, someone who needs to learn from the ground up how to build something real, something of value, someone who needs to earn back his own name, one brick, one honest day's work at a time. The choice hung in the air between us, the path to redemption, or the road to ruin. It was his to make. I had destroyed his kingdom of lies, but I was now offering him a single, difficult, and perhaps the only path back to the world of honorable men. The final blueprint was on the table. The rest was up to him. As I walked out of St. Jude's, I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a bitter taste of revenge. I felt quiet. It was the quiet that comes after a controlled demolition. The dust was still settling, but the rotted structure had been brought down cleanly, efficiently, and with a purpose. The future of my legacy and my grandson was now in safer hands. Back inside the chapel, the silence was broken, not by my children, but by the parish council. I was told later, by Father Michael, what transpired in those first few minutes after my departure. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose business empire was built on a reputation for ruthless but fair dealings, was the first to speak. He didn't address Thomas or Isabella. He addressed the council. "Well," he said, his voice a low growl of disapproval, "it seems we have gravely misjudged the character of some of our parishioners. Mrs. Sterling, a woman who commanded the city's most powerful charity boards, looked at Isabella with an expression of pure, icy disdain. 'Isabella, my dear,' she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was a weapon in itself. 'I believe your position as co-chair of the Children's Hospital Gala Committee is no longer tenable. We require leaders who embody the values of family. Clearly you do not.' It was a public execution, delivered with the polite brutality of high society. Isabella, who had lived for the approval of these people, was now being cast out by them. Her greatest ambition had become her greatest shame. Thomas, desperate to salvage something, tried to appeal to them as a fellow man of finance. 'Please,' he stammered, 'this is a family matter, a misunderstanding. My father, he's an old man. He's emotional.' It was the wrong thing to say. The retired judge on the council, a man who had spent his life dissecting lies, cut him off. 'Mr. Sterling,' he said, his voice like cracking ice, 'we all heard your father. He was not emotional. He was precise. He was logical. And he was just. The only misunderstanding here seems to be your own regarding the definition of honor. They were ostracized, not just disinherited. Their social currency, which they had valued more than family, had just been declared worthless. Father Michael finally intervened, not to offer them comfort, but to deliver the final administrative blow. 'Thomas, Isabella,' he said, his voice tired but firm. 'I think it is best if you find another parish to worship in. Your presence here would be a distraction. The ushers will show you out. They were exiled from their spiritual home, the very stage they had tried to command, by the community they had betrayed. I imagine that walk down the aisle, the second one in 2 days, was much different from the first. It was not a walk of triumph, but a walk of shame, past the cold, unforgiving eyes of the jury they had unwittingly chosen for themselves. My own days that followed were a strange mixture of peace and unexpected attention. News travels fast in a tight-knit community. My phone began to ring. It wasn't my children. It was the members of the council. Mr. Abernathy called to invite me to dinner. Mrs. Sterling wanted my advice on a new wing for the hospital. The judge wanted to play a round of golf. I had spent years being invisible to them, the quiet, working-class father of the ambitious Thomas Sterling. Now I was Arthur Sterling, the philanthropist, the man of integrity, the secret pillar of their community. I had not sought their approval, and in a final, beautiful irony, it was now being freely offered. I had become the very thing my son and his wife had tried to be, not by performance, but by character. I politely accepted some invitations, and just as politely declined others. I had no interest in becoming a socialite, but I did enjoy the quiet, respectful conversations with men and women who were my peers, who understood the world of building, of legacy, of responsibility. The most significant change, however, was in the house. It was quiet, yes, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of sanctuary. I found myself spending more time in my workshop, not just fixing things, but creating. I started carving small, intricate wooden toys. A rocking horse, a set of building blocks, a puzzle box, all for a grandson I could not yet see, but for whom I was now building a different kind of inheritance. An inheritance of things made with love, with patience, with the very hands my daughter-in-law had found so defiling. About a week after the meeting, my lawyer, Mr. Davies, forwarded me an official letter. It was from Thomas and Isabella's lawyer. It was a formal, desperate plea. They were contesting the amendment to the will. They claimed I had been unduly influenced by Father Michael, that my decision was made under emotional distress, that I was not of sound mind when I disinherited them. The letter was a predictable, pathetic attempt to fight back, but they had forgotten who they were dealing with. I had not just made a speech. I had built a case. The legal challenge was a declaration of war, a foolish, desperate one, but a war nonetheless. They were accusing me of being mentally incompetent, the very insult they had planned to use against me, now repurposed as a legal weapon. They were arguing that my profound love for the church and my grief over their actions had clouded my judgment. They were, in essence, trying to use my own virtues against me. This could get messy, Arthur, Mr. Davies warned, his brow furrowed. Competency hearings can be brutal. They'll dig into your life, your habits, your health. They will try to paint you as an eccentric, grieving old man who was manipulated. Let them try, I said, a cold smile touching my lips for the first time. They think this is a courtroom battle. They are mistaken. This is a demolition, and I have already planted the charges. I had anticipated this move. I knew their greed would not allow them to accept defeat gracefully. They would fight, and in doing so, they would walk directly into the final inescapable trap I had laid for them. Mr. Davies, I said, I want you to send them a reply, a very simple one. Inform them that we will not be contesting their claim in court. In fact, we welcome it. And as a gesture of goodwill, we will provide them with a piece of evidence that might be pertinent to their case regarding my emotional state. Davies looked at me, completely baffled. Arthur, what are you talking about? We have to fight this. We can't just give them evidence. Trust me, I said. This piece of evidence will end the war before it even begins. Send them the video. The video? Before the baptism, I explained to my stunned lawyer, I had a feeling that Isabella might try to create some sort of drama. Her ambition made her predictable. So I asked a friend of mine, a private investigator, to install a small, high-definition camera to record the ceremony. I told myself it was just to have a beautiful memory of my grandson's special day. But a part of me, the old contractor, the man who always prepares for the worst-case scenario, knew it might be needed for something else. "You have the entire incident on video?" Davies breathed, his eyes wide with a lawyer's glee. Every word, every calculated stumble, every disgusted look, I confirmed. "Send it to them, and tell them this. This is Exhibit A. It will be presented not just in the competency hearing, but also in a separate civil suit. I am now prepared to file against them for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Furthermore, a copy has been sent to every member of the parish council and to the Archbishop himself for their review. The trap was no longer just about disinheritance. It was now about total, utter annihilation of their reputation and their potential future. They had a choice: drop their baseless lawsuit and disappear into obscurity, or proceed and have their vile actions played out on a screen in a court of law and in the highest offices of the church, ensuring they would be pariahs for the rest of their lives. The response came less than 24 hours later. A single, frantic, capitulating letter. They were dropping the lawsuit. They would not contest the will. They understood their position. They were utterly, completely defeated. The demolition was complete. I sat in my workshop, the letter on my bench, and picked up the small, hand-carved cross I had made for my grandson, the one Isabella had dismissed as rustic. It was simple, honest, and made of strong, enduring wood. I had protected his future, and in doing so, I had honored the past. I had honored Maria. A few days later, Father Michael came to visit. He brought a bottle of old scotch and 2 glasses. We sat in my quiet living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "It's over, then," he said, pouring the amber liquid. "It is," I confirmed. "Have you heard from them?" "Only through their lawyers," I said. "They are gone. They are moving to another state, I believe, trying to start over where no one knows their name." "And the boy?" he asked gently. "His future is secure," I said, taking a sip of the scotch. "In the hands of good people. He will learn the right lessons." We sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, 2 old friends who had seen a great and terrible storm and had weathered it together. "You know, Arthur," Michael said finally, swirling the scotch in his glass, "in the Bible, justice is often swift and terrible, a pillar of salt, a flood. But sometimes, I think the most profound justice is the quiet, patient, and inescapable consequence of one's own character. You didn't smite them, you simply built a mirror and forced them to look into it." I looked at the picture of Maria on the mantel. Her smile seemed to approve. "I'm a builder, Michael," I said. "It's the only thing I've ever really known how to do." The year that followed was not marked by drama or conflict, but by the slow, steady, and satisfying work of building. The echoes of the battle faded, replaced by the quiet rhythms of a new life. I did not move. I did not sell the house. I stayed. It was my home, filled with Maria's memory, and I would not let the bitterness of my children's actions drive me from it. But the house was no longer just a house. It became a hub. My workshop, once a solitary sanctuary, was now open every Saturday to a group of young men and women from the parish, kids from troubled homes who needed a mentor. I taught them the basics of carpentry, the satisfaction of creating something useful with their own hands. I taught them that a straight line and a solid joint were matters of character, not just craft. My home became a place of learning, of second chances. The parish council, now the board of trustees for my grandson's inheritance, became my friends. We met not as adversaries or social climbers, but as partners in a shared mission. I was no longer an invisible man. I was a respected member of a community I had helped build. It made me realize that family isn't always about the blood you share, but about the respect you are given and the community you build. It's about the people who show up, who see your worth when others refuse to. What do you think? Is family defined by blood or by bond? I'd be truly interested to read your thoughts in the comments below. I never heard from Isabella directly again. The silence was a gulf between us. I heard, through Father Michael, that she and Thomas had divorced. She had lost the status she craved and had moved on, likely in search of another stage for her ambitions. Thomas, adrift and alone, had taken a menial job in a distant city, a man forever haunted by the ghost of the fortune he had thrown away. I did not pity them. I simply released them. They were a chapter of my life that was now closed. My story was now about the future. It was about the bright, curious eyes of the teenagers in my workshop. It was about the laughter of my grandson as he patted the soft earth around a rose bush his grandmother had loved. One afternoon, Father Michael stopped by. He was holding an envelope. "This arrived at the rectory," he said. "It's from Thomas." My first instinct was to refuse it, but I opened it. The letter was short. "Dad," it began, "I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I am writing to tell you that I have started to attend a small church here. The priest is teaching me about atonement, not the kind you read about, but the kind you live. He told me that atonement is about becoming the person you should have been all along. I have a long way to go, but I have started. I just wanted you to know that." There was no return address. It was not a plea for reconciliation. It was a sign that a soul, which I had thought lost, was finally beginning to fight its own war for redemption. I folded the letter. The path he walked now was his own. Stories like this, where character is tested and justice, in its own way, finds the light, are the reason we are here. They remind us that true strength isn't about the noise you make, but about the foundations you build. If you believe in the power of these stories and want to hear more tales of integrity triumphing over greed, I invite you to become a part of our community. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to continue sharing them.